There is a map, not a famous one, not one you would find in a standard museum display. A printed copy of it has been sitting in a folder on my desk for 3 years, and I have never fully put it away. It shows Antarctica's coastline, not as ice, but as bare land. The coastline is detailed, accurate in a way that took modern satellite imaging to confirm. The rivers are there, the mountain ridges are there, and this map was drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis, who wrote in the margins that he copied it from much older sources he no longer had access to. I have spent a long time sitting with that map, not obsessing over it, not building theories around it, just sitting with it the way you sit with a question that refuses to close, because the problem is not the map itself. The problem is what the map implies about whoever drew the original. Antarctica, as modern science tells it, has been buried under ice for approximately 34 million years. That is the established figure. The continent froze over in what geologists call the Eocene-Oligocene transition, long before anything resembling a human civilization walked the Earth. There is no mystery there, officially. The timeline is well supported. I want to be honest with you. I find that explanation deeply reasonable. The geological evidence for Antarctica's freezing is not thin. Ice core samples, sediment analysis, isotopic dating, these are not fringe methods. They are the same tools we use to understand every other major event in planetary history, and they consistently agree. The mainstream position is also not naive about the continent's past. Scientists acknowledge that Antarctica was once temperate. It hosted forests, running rivers, subtropical vegetation. Fossils of those plants have been recovered from beneath the ice. The official story does not deny that life once flourished there. It simply places that life in a time before humans existed. And for a long time, that was enough for me. The question seemed settled by the kind of evidence that does not leave much room for argument. I moved on to other things. I always do. But the map stayed on the desk. The specific problem with the Piri Reis map is not that it exists. It is that it should not have been possible. In 1513, no European expedition had reached Antarctica. The continent would not be officially discovered for another 300 years. In 1820, 3 centuries of open ocean stood between that map and any known source. Piri Reis wrote notes in the margins. He explained that he compiled the map from approximately 20 older charts, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. He did not claim to have explored the southern continent himself. He was a compiler. He was copying something that already existed. Now here is where I want to slow down, because this is the kind of claim that invites a lot of noise, and the noise is understandable. Conspiracy thinking moves fast, fills gaps eagerly, and reaches conclusions before the evidence has finished speaking. I am trying very hard not to do that here. The skeptical explanation for the Piri Reis map is reasonable, and I take it seriously. Some cartographers argue that the southern landmass shown is not Antarctica at all, but a misplaced or exaggerated representation of South America's tip. Others suggest the accuracy is coincidental, an artifact of guesswork that happens to resemble reality. Both are fair objections. Cartography in the 16th century was imprecise, political, and often decorative. Maps were status objects as much as navigational tools, and mapmakers sometimes filled unknown southern regions with invented landmasses because a blank space looked unfinished. I have read those arguments carefully. They are not unreasonable, but they run into a specific difficulty. In 1960, a professor named Charles Hapgood presented a detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map to a US Air Force cartographic team. That team's official response, a letter that still exists, concluded that the southern landmass matches the subglacial topography of Antarctica with striking accuracy. Subglacial topography, the shape of the land beneath the ice, not the ice itself, the rock underneath it. That data was only obtained by modern seismic surveys in the 20th century, and yet the correlation between the map and those surveys was described by trained cartographers as too precise to be random guesswork. If that were the only anomaly, I would set it aside. One strange document, however accurate, does not constitute a pattern, but the Piri Reis map is not alone. It belongs to a category of artifacts and records that appear across different cultures, different centuries, and different continents, all pointing at the same location. Ancient Greek geographers wrote confidently about a great southern continent they called Terra Australis Incognita. They had never been there. They reasoned its existence philosophically. The northern landmass must be balanced by a southern one, but some of their descriptions went beyond philosophy. They named features, described interior geography that modern survey has since confirmed. Medieval Arab scholars preserved and extended Greek geographical knowledge, and several of them wrote about the southern continent with a specificity that surprised modern researchers. Not as myth, not as legend, as geography, as a place with dimensions, with coastlines, with inland elevations, written in a tone that implies the information came from somewhere older than the writer. In 1531, a French cartographer named Orens Finet produced a map showing Antarctica with river systems flowing outward from a central landmass. His depiction of what is now called the Ross Sea aligns in key ways with modern bathymetric data. He was working nearly 3 centuries before the continent's official discovery in 1820. A Venetian cartographer named Giacomo Gastaldi produced a similar map in 1546. A German cartographer, Johannes Schöner, had drawn one in 1515, 2 years after Piri Reis. None of these men knew each other. None had access to the same documented primary sources, and yet they all drew the same continent, with the same basic geography. This is where coincidence becomes uncomfortable. One map could be a mistake, a fiction, a lucky guess. 2 might share a lost common source, but 4 maps from 4 different countries produced within a 30-year window, all depicting a continent that would not be officially discovered for 3 more centuries. That is a different kind of problem. I want to pause and acknowledge the most straightforward explanation, because it deserves to be said plainly. Cartographic copying was widespread in the 16th century. Mapmakers routinely borrowed from each other, often without credit. It is entirely possible that all 4 maps trace back to a single shared source, now lost, that was itself fictional or speculative. That explanation works well enough until you test it against the accuracy. Fictional source maps tend to produce fictional geography, invented coastlines, mountains in the wrong place, exaggerated features. What these maps show, particularly where modern subglacial surveys have been conducted, is not invented geography. It is detailed geography that happens to be correct. And then there is the ice question, which is the part I always return to. If Antarctica has been sealed under ice for 34 million years, then whoever drew the original source maps, the ones these cartographers were copying, would have needed to survey it while it was still ice-free, on bare land, with instruments. That is either the most extraordinary thing I have ever encountered in years of reading about this subject, or it is a mistake so large that I am simply missing it. I spend time with both options. I want to miss it. The second possibility would be much easier to live with. Here I need to be careful, because this is where alternative history writing tends to sprint past the evidence and start naming civilizations. Atlantis gets invoked. I understand the impulse. When you encounter a gap this large, you want to fill it, but filling it prematurely is its own form of dishonesty, and I am trying to resist that. What I can say, without naming anything, is this: the gap exists. Something or someone surveyed Antarctica's coastline and interior while the land was accessible. The maps are accurate enough to demand that conclusion. What they do not tell us is who, or how, or when, and those are not small omissions. Let me bring in a different category of evidence, because maps alone are not enough to build a serious case. In the 1990s, a series of sediment core samples were extracted from the Ross Sea floor. What they found was not entirely expected, at least not at the depth where they found it. The cores contained layers of fine-grained sediment consistent with rivers draining into open water, not glacial sediment. River sediment, the kind deposited slowly over time by running fresh water finding its way to the sea, and the dating on those layers placed them at approximately 6,000 years ago, not 34 million. 6,000 years ago is not deep geological time, it is human time. It is the era of the earliest recorded civilizations: Mesopotamia, early Egypt, Proto-Indus Valley settlement. It is within the range where human memory, oral tradition, and early writing could, in theory, have preserved knowledge of what existed there. I need to stop here again. The 6,000-year dating has been contested. Some geologists argue that the sediment layers were disturbed, misread, or that the dating methodology was applied incorrectly to that particular type of deposit. It is a live scientific debate, not a settled conclusion, and I do not want to present it otherwise. But the sediment itself, the fact of river-deposited material in those cores, has not been seriously disputed. The argument is about when, not whether, and even the more conservative readings suggest a period of ice-free conditions in parts of Antarctica more recent than the standard 34 million year figure allows. In 2012, a paper published in a peer-reviewed geology journal reported evidence of a temperate climate event in East Antarctica approximately 12,000 years ago. Not forests, not tropics, but open water, exposed land, conditions that would have made coastal habitation theoretically possible. The paper received almost no coverage outside specialist academic circles. 12,000 years. That places us in the period known as the Younger Dryas boundary, the same geological window associated with sudden climate change, mass extinction events, and what some researchers have proposed was a global catastrophic impact. It is one of the most debated and consequential periods in recent Earth history. I am not saying these things are connected. I am saying they occupy the same time frame. The maps, the sediment cores, the temperature records, the Greek geographical traditions, they all cluster around the same general window. That clustering could be coincidence, but it is the kind of coincidence that a careful person sits with for a long time. At some point in any investigation like this, you have to ask a different kind of question. Not just what is the evidence, but why don't we know more? Why is Antarctica the most restricted landmass on Earth? Why do international treaties govern access to it with a specificity that applies to no other geographic region? The Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959 by 12 nations and since expanded to 54, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve. Military activity is prohibited. Territorial claims are frozen. Scientific research is, in theory, open and cooperative. It is on its face an admirable piece of international law, practically unique in the history of geopolitics. What makes it unusual is the uniformity. The treaty was signed during the height of the Cold War, a period when the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on almost nothing. They were competing in space, competing in armaments, competing in every theatre of geopolitical influence available to them. And yet on Antarctica, they cooperated without apparent difficulty. I want to be fair to the obvious explanation. The treaty was signed partly because both superpowers wanted to prevent the other from establishing a military presence on the continent. Mutual restriction was in both their interests. It is not irrational. It does not require anything hidden to explain it. Institutional self-interest is enough. But institutional self-interest does not fully explain the depth of the restriction. Scientists working in Antarctica today describe approval processes that go beyond standard research protocols. Certain inland regions require years of advance access requests. Private expeditions are effectively impossible. And the continent's interior has seen remarkably little public-facing research relative to its geographical scale. No single institution is responsible for this. That is the important thing to understand. It is not one government or one military body that controls access. The restriction emerges from the overlap of treaty obligations, logistics, funding structures, and institutional priorities that together produce a single outcome, a continent that remains largely unseen. Silence that organizes without a coordinator is harder to argue against than a named conspiracy. A named conspiracy can be investigated and refuted. A structural silence, one that emerges from shared institutional interest rather than shared planning, has no center. There is no document to find, no meeting to expose. There is only the pattern of what remains unknown. And the pattern here is not subtle. The continent that holds the most anomalous geographical and geological data on Earth is also the continent with the most restricted access, the least independent research, and the smallest public knowledge base proportional to its size. I am not drawing a conclusion from that. I am describing it. In 1946, the United States Navy launched one of the largest military operations in the history of polar exploration, Operation High Jump. Led by Admiral Richard Byrd, it involved 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft, resources far beyond what any purely scientific expedition would require. The stated mission was to establish a research base. Byrd returned from the operation early. The mission was cut short, officially due to weather and supply issues. What he said afterward, in an interview with a Chilean newspaper in 1947, was not about weather. He spoke about the possibility of attacks from the poles, of craft capable of travelling from pole to pole at extraordinary speeds. I am aware of how that sounds, and I want to name the skeptical reading plainly. Byrd was a decorated public figure who had spent years cultivating his own legend. It is entirely possible that his comments were exaggerated for effect, misunderstood in translation, or taken out of context by journalists who wanted a dramatic story. All of that is possible. What I find harder to explain is the scale of the operation itself. 4,700 military personnel, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. That is not how you conduct scientific research. If the mission was what the official record says it was, the resources are catastrophically disproportionate to the stated purpose. The operation's classified documents have been partially released over the decades, but significant sections remain restricted. What has been released does not contradict the official scientific explanation. It also does not explain the scale, and the gap between those two facts, the explanation and the scale, is where most of the serious questions live. Then there is Lake Vostok. 4 kilometers beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet lies a liquid freshwater lake the size of Lake Ontario. Sealed from the surface for an estimated 15 million years, according to official figures, When Russian scientists drilled into it in 2012, the initial results were, in their own words, unexpected. The water samples from Lake Vostok contained DNA from organisms not previously catalogued. That is scientifically significant. Though not inherently mysterious, isolated ecosystems produce unique biology. But the drilling was suspended shortly after initial samples were taken, and the full biological analysis has not been released to the open scientific literature. There is a reasonable explanation for that delay, and I acknowledge it. Contamination concerns are legitimate in subglacial drilling. Introducing surface organisms into a pristine ancient ecosystem is a serious scientific and ethical problem, and caution around that kind of access is genuinely warranted. Science moves slowly in complex environments. That is not suppression, it is method. But the silence around the biological findings is now more than a decade old, and it sits alongside the silence around the geological anomalies, alongside the silence around the cartographic record, alongside the silence around Operation High Jump's true scope. Each silence, individually, has a reasonable explanation. Together, they begin to describe a room with no windows. I want to take you back to something basic, because the most important element of this investigation is not any single piece of evidence. It is the structure of the question itself. We are being asked to believe that an entire continent, 1/10 of the Earth's land surface, holds no significant mysteries, that the maps were coincidental, that the sediment cores were misread, that the temperature records were outliers, that the cartographic accuracy was luck, that the military operations were purely logistical, that the treaty restrictions are purely procedural, that the biological findings are simply delayed, that every anomaly independently has a mundane explanation. Each of those explanations may be correct. I hold that possibility seriously. What I cannot do is hold all of them correct simultaneously, without noticing that they are performing the same function, absorbing every anomaly, neutralizing every contradiction, and producing an outcome in which the continent remains, always exactly as mysterious as it was before any question was asked. That is not a property of good explanations. Good explanations reduce mystery. They give you less to wonder about, not more. When every answer to every question about a subject produces the same result, the same blank wall, the same closed door, you start to wonder whether the wall is the answer. There is a concept in philosophy of science called underdetermination, the idea that any set of data can be explained by multiple competing theories equally well. We choose among them not always by evidence alone, but by institutional consensus, by what the dominant framework allows us to see. I think about this when I look at Antarctica. What we know for certain is smaller than what we are told. We know the continent exists and is largely inaccessible. We know maps were drawn of it before its discovery. We know sediment cores suggest conditions more recent than the official timeline allows. We know a massive military operation went there and returned early without full explanation. What we do not know is whether these things are connected. And more importantly, we do not know whether the absence of connection has been verified or simply assumed. That is the question I find myself unable to set down. Not whether something is there, whether we have genuinely looked. The last thing I want to leave you with is not evidence. It is a question of scale. Antarctica is 14 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined. Of that total landmass, the area surveyed at resolution sufficient to detect structural features beneath the ice is a small fraction. We have not looked at most of it. Not really. The surveys we have are partial, the coverage is uneven, and the technologies capable of deep subglacial imaging have only recently become available. We are, in the most literal sense, at the beginning of knowing what is under that ice, not at the end. And somewhere in that gap between what has been surveyed and what has not, between the maps that exist and the originals that don't, between the questions that have been asked and the ones that have been quietly avoided, there is a question that I think is more important than any answer I have found. Not what is under the ice. That question is too large and too open on its own. The more specific question, the one I keep returning to, the one that generates unease no matter how carefully I approach it, is this: if something was there, would we be told? I do not mean that as a paranoid question. I mean it as a structural one. Think about the institutions that hold treaty authority over Antarctica. The military organizations that have conducted the largest operations there. The scientific bodies that control access and funding. Think about what discovery of a prior civilization would mean to every one of them simultaneously. It would not mean a press conference. It would not mean a documentary and a Nobel Prize. It would mean the most consequential reordering of human self-understanding in recorded history. Every religious tradition, every historical framework, every model of human development would require immediate revision. That is not something institutions manage transparently, and I am not saying it has happened. I am not saying a civilization has been found. I am saying that the incentive structure for concealment, if such a discovery were made, would be essentially total. Every institution with access would have more to lose from disclosure than from silence. That dynamic does not require conspiracy. It requires only self-interest. I keep thinking about something a geologist told me years ago about the pace of Antarctic research. He said the continent was like a library where most of the books are still on the shelves, unread. Except, he added, and this was the part that stayed with me, no one is in a hurry to read them. I asked him why. He said funding is difficult, logistics are brutal, and the scientific community's priorities lie elsewhere. He said it without any particular weight, the way you explain something that has never occurred to you to find strange. And I sat with that for a long time after. The incuriosity of people with access. Because if I had access to that library, if I were among the handful of institutions with resources to look beneath that ice, I would look, not for conspiracy, not for civilization. Simply because the question is there, and the gap is there, and the maps are there, and none of it has been fully explained. That is the thing I return to. Not the anomalies themselves, but the absence of urgency around them. The Piri race map has been known for over a century. The sediment core data has existed for decades, and the official response has been, consistently, to address each piece in isolation and never ask what they mean together. Maybe that is reasonable. Maybe it is the right scientific instinct. Treat each anomaly on its own terms. Do not let speculation contaminate methodology. Wait for more data. I have tried to follow that principle throughout, but there is a point at which the consistent absence of connection becomes its own kind of data point. The map is still on my desk. I have looked at it more times than I can count. I have traced the coastline with a finger, matched it against the subglacial survey data, held the two images side by side until the alignment became impossible to look away from, and I always end up in the same place. Not with an answer, not with a name for what was there, or when it was there, or how it knew what the ice was hiding. I end up at a door. Not a metaphorical door, I mean the literal fact of an unexplored continent, a surveyed but never explained coastline, and 14 million square kilometers of unread silence. And what I cannot tell you, what no one, as far as I can find, has been able to honestly tell you, is whether anyone has ever stood at that door and decided, for reasons that were never recorded, not to open it.
1840. That's the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not a range, not an era, a single year, 3 expeditions, American, British, French, each independently sailed to the same frozen continent, Antarctica, within months of one another. I accepted that for years. Parallel exploration, the age of discovery, makes sense on the surface. Then I found a single line buried in a footnote of Wilkes's suppressed expedition log, a line that his superiors redacted in the published version. 7 words. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 50 years later, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica, led by a Norwegian-British explorer named Borchgrevink, gave a single interview describing his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section wasn't translated into English for 60 years. That's when I stopped being able to look away. Let's establish what we know, what the textbooks tell us, what the official record, such as it is, allows. And Charles Wilkes, American naval officer, he departed in August 1838, leading a squadron of 6 vessels. He charted over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1842. His report, the one he filed, was disputed almost immediately by his own officers. Not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features, formations. His officers noted discrepancies in what the official log recorded versus what crew members described in private correspondence later recovered by researchers. Wilkes faced court-martial upon his return. Not once, multiple times over the course of his career. He was accused of illegal punishment of crew, of conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most charges. But he spent the next several decades of his life buried in bureaucratic obscurity, his Antarctic findings overshadowed, his personal journals heavily edited before publication. Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission ostensibly was to push further south than any French vessel had gone before, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolour in ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. Adélie Land, named for his wife, was charted. He is remembered. He is celebrated. In May 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son, did not survive. Much of the material he'd been travelling with, including expedition documents he was reportedly transporting for review, gone, not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire, on a train, in France, 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not saying that means anything. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But I ask you to hold that detail. Just hold it. And James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the 3. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice the height of the White Cliffs of Dover, stretching for hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, dispassionate, and yet his crew logs, the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, the ones that took researchers decades to fully access, contain passages that don't appear anywhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References in at least 2 independent crew journals to what sounds like structured stone, not ice, stone. If you follow the thread further, and once you start, it becomes genuinely difficult to stop, you arrive at Carsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-British explorer. He was part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became, by most accounts, the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent. Not just chart it from offshore, not just approach and retreat. Land, stand on it, walk. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition, the Southern Cross expedition, and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent, the first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? Here is where the official record does something I've come to recognise. It narrows. It becomes very specific about certain things: the cold, the isolation, the biological samples, the meteorological measurements, and very vague, almost deliberately vague, about others. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. The official cause: a digestive condition. He was 29 years old. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death receives one paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned from the expedition and spent the rest of his life declining to speak publicly about what he'd experienced. He gave one interview, one to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer gently called episodes of geographic fixation. That is, crew members who became convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organised, something that shouldn't be there. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own writings, the more you notice a particular pattern in his language. He is precise about logistics, he is detailed about wildlife. He becomes strangely abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive, when describing the interior geology, when describing what the rock looked like where the wind had scoured the ice away, when describing what the formations reminded him of. He never finishes those sentences, not once, not metaphorically. Literally, in at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is either cut short, transitions abruptly to a different subject, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the version filed with his expedition sponsors. If you're finding this investigation useful, if these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this kind of scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Let's talk about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly covered in ice. This is well established. There are exposed rock regions, nunataks they're called, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the actual surface of the continent, where, under the right conditions of wind and drift, you can see what lies beneath the ice sheet at the margins. Early expedition members described repeatedly formations in these exposed zones that struck them as anomalous. The language varies: peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements unlike natural weathering patterns. But the theme repeats with an unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning several decades. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals, stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was published privately by his family in 1931 and has never been incorporated into mainstream historical literature, did not break the way stone breaks. Now, geologists will tell you about columnar basalt. They'll explain frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rock to cleave in angular patterns. I know that. I've read those explanations. And I want to be fair, those explanations account for a great deal of what early explorers may have found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they'd ever seen. But here is the point where the orthodox explanation becomes harder to sustain. It's not the angles, it's the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who had never met, who in some cases were citizens of actively competing nations, who had no mechanism for coordinating their accounts, described similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location, different locations separated by hundreds of miles. If it's natural geology, columnar basalt, frost fracture, erosion, then that's interesting but unremarkable. Antarctic geology is relatively uniform in places, fine. But if you overlay the approximate locations described in these various accounts, a pattern emerges that doesn't map neatly onto known geological formations. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest, and I want to be careful here, I want to use the word suggest, distribution, intentional placement, spacing, not a quarry, not a single building, something larger, something that would require you to step back, very far back, to perceive as a whole. And here is where this becomes genuinely impossible to brush aside. For the official history to hold, for the natural geology plus overexcited explorers explanation to fully account for what we find in these records, you need to explain something. You need to explain why 3 separate governments in the same decade with no coordinated communication all chose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions. The United States did not publish Wilkes's complete charts for years. Some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, and a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published d'Urville's account, but the account itself has been noted by at least 2 French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways, always the same kinds of divergence: the geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like. Not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The rocks. Why the rocks? 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. The official explanation doesn't just strain here, it collapses entirely. Because for this to be coincidence, you'd need to believe that 3 separate governments operating in competitive isolation all independently decided that the geological features of Antarctica were too sensitive to publish accurately, for reasons none of them ever formally articulated, within the same 20-year window. Or something else, something they all saw or were told about that required the same response. Here is where I have to be honest about the limits of what I can demonstrate versus what I can only gesture toward. There is a body of research, not fringe research, not anonymous internet speculation, but work by architectural historians, by geographers, by scholars of cartographic anomalies, that has been quietly building a case for the existence of a prior world-spanning civilization whose reach was substantially broader and whose erasure was substantially more deliberate than mainstream history acknowledges. You will have encountered this material under various names: the maps produced before formal exploration, the Piri-Reis map, the Orontius-Phineas map, which appear to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that shouldn't have been possible. Coastlines that match sub-ice topography, only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines depicted without the ice that now covers them. How? The standard answer that these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits that there existed cartographic knowledge of Antarctica before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers in the 16th century could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just doesn't ask who. And here is where the thread from 1840 connects to something much larger. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, or prior to the history we're permitted to access, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, capable of construction in extreme environments, capable of leaving traces in the rock that would still be visible to 19th century naval officers even through accumulated centuries of ice and weathering, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And the question after that is why the record of its habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently, so erased on a worldwide scale. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government, erased, across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition with each other, and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence. I want to return to the human element for a moment, because this isn't just an archival mystery, it's a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crew is not something widely discussed in mainstream historical literature. But it's documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilkes expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis that covered everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. Now, I know what the rational response to that is. Isolation, hypoxia, the psychological strain of extreme environment, the visual distortions caused by Antarctic light phenomena. Fata Morgana, the mirage effect that polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, in which distant ice can appear to take on the shapes of towers, walls, buildings. All of that is real. All of that is documented. I'm not dismissing it. But here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. They were not generic castles or European cityscapes transposed onto the ice. The architectural descriptions that survived in private letters, in unpublished journals, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, those descriptions have a specific character. Massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick. Layout suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, districts, grids, and they described it as buried, visible only in fragments, as if whatever they were seeing, whether by mirage or hallucination or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger still concealed beneath the ice. One officer, I'll decline to name him because his family is still identifiable, wrote in a letter to his brother that he had seen from the ship's deck. A sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance I cannot estimate, and bearing no resemblance to any formation I was able to attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he had reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. The letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper. That paper was never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. What strikes me, the longer I sit with this material, isn't the individual anomalies. Any single one of these could be explained. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter taken alone. Each of these is manageable. Historical noise, it's the pattern, not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths alone, not the raving crew members alone, not the pre-ice maps alone, all of it, together, pointing in the same direction, across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to cooperate, and yet cooperating, or at least converging on a single uniform absence. The question isn't who made the decision. Maybe no single person did. Maybe the decision made itself the way certain truths, if they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the movie sense, something slower, something more diffuse, something that operates through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. Because if what these expedition members saw was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale was what the descriptions suggest, if the geographic distribution maps onto something intentional, then the implications don't stop at Antarctica. They ripple backward through everything, every timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and reach of human civilization, every map, every founding myth of every nation that sent ships to that ice. Once you allow that possibility in, even as a question, even as a hypothesis held lightly and provisionally, once you see the shape of what the evidence suggests, you understand why the silence is so total, and so coordinated and so old. 3 expeditions, 1 silence. What did they find on that coastline that required 3 competing nations to independently arrive at the same mission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins where the wind had pulled the ice away that made experienced naval officers reach for language they couldn't quite complete? Why do the pre-colonial maps know what they shouldn't know? Why do the men who saw it most closely come back change, some of them broken, some of them silent, some of them dead before they could be properly questioned? What is the relationship between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been documenting quietly in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization scale evidence that appears wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see rather than what they've been told to see. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports, but I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence, to watch the same absence repeat itself across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there, waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough.
Antarctica is the 5th largest continent on Earth. It is larger than Europe. It is larger than Australia. It contains roughly 70% of the world's fresh water, locked inside 2 miles of ice. And yet, according to the version of history we were all handed in school, human beings had absolutely no knowledge of its existence until 1820. Think about that date carefully. Not the discovery of a new island, not the charting of an unknown coastline somewhere in the Pacific. The complete non-existence, in recorded human memory, of an entire continent, one that covers 14 million square kilometers, until 2 centuries ago. That is the official position, and for most people, it requires no further examination. I understand why. The explanation is straightforward and internally consistent. Antarctica is remote. It is surrounded by the most violent ocean on the planet. The Southern Ocean is a wall of storm and cold that, before modern navigation and steam power, was genuinely impassable for extended exploration. The fact that no ancient civilization mapped it is not strange, it is expected, even logical. I accepted that explanation for a long time. And then I looked at a map made in 1513. The Piri Reis map is not obscure. It is held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It is a genuine historical document, authenticated, undisputed in its age. What is disputed, quietly, carefully, institutionally, is what it appears to show along its southern edge. A continuous landmass beneath the southernmost charted territories, running roughly where Antarctica sits, drawn in some detail, including what appear to be bays and inlets. Now, before you let that settle too heavily, I want to do what I always try to do when something pulls at me. I want to find the least dramatic explanation, and there is one ready at hand. Scholars have long argued that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is simply Terra Australis Incognita, the hypothetical southern continent that ancient Greek philosophers proposed must exist to balance the northern landmasses. A theoretical landmass, not a mapped one. That is a reasonable argument. It has genuine scholarly weight. And if the Piri Reis map were the only artifact that raised this question, I think it would be enough to close the file entirely and move on. But it is not the only one. The Orontius Phineas map, drawn in 1531, shows a landmass at the South Pole that, when subjected to cartographic analysis, matches the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica, not the ice surface, but the land beneath the ice, with a degree of accuracy that would not be achievable through philosophical speculation. The rivers, the mountain ranges, the coastal bays, these are not invented. The land beneath Antarctica's ice sheet was not measured by modern instruments until the mid-20th century. A Jesuit scholar named Charles Hapgood spent years in the 1950s and 1960s analyzing these maps with the assistance of cartographers at the United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command. The conclusion his team reached, carefully, reluctantly, with full acknowledgement of how strange it sounded, was that some of these maps appeared to have been compiled from source documents that predated the last ice age's peak glaciation in Antarctica. Source documents, not speculation, not theory, drawn sources. I want to pause here because I can feel the weight of what I am describing, and I want to hold it honestly. Hapgood's work has been criticised, significantly criticised. Professional cartographers have pointed out that some of the comparisons require selective interpretation, that the matches between the old maps and the actual subglacial topography are not as precise as his supporters claim, that there is a confirmation bias risk in pattern matching across projections and scales. These are legitimate criticisms. I do not dismiss them. And yet, when I sit with the full body of evidence, not just one map, not just Hapgood's analysis, but the accumulating weight of what we actually know about Antarctica's geological history, I find that the skeptical explanations become harder to maintain, not easier. Not because of the maps themselves, but because of what the ice cores tell us. Here is what the geological record shows. Antarctica was not always ice-covered. There were periods, the most recent ending roughly 12,000 years ago, when significant portions of the continent were temperate, when rivers ran, when plant life existed, when the coastal regions of what is now buried under 2 miles of ice were by any measure habitable. This is not fringe science. This is published, peer-reviewed, thoroughly established paleoclimatology. 12,000 years ago is not a mythological time frame. It is not the distant past of dinosaurs or supercontinent drift. 12,000 years ago, human beings were building the first proto-cities in the Fertile Crescent. They were crossing into the Americas. They were painting caves in Europe with a sophistication that still silences professional artists when they see it up close. 12,000 years ago, humanity was not primitive in the way we casually assume. So here is the question I cannot put down. If Antarctica was habitable 12,000 years ago, genuinely habitable, with rivers and temperate coastlines, and the conditions that historically produce settled civilization, then what was living there? And more precisely, what happened to it? The official answer is nothing. Nothing we know of. The transition to full glaciation was gradual, spanning thousands of years, and whatever populations may have existed in Antarctica's temperate periods either never developed beyond basic subsistence or migrated northward as the ice advanced, and left no distinct record that has been recovered. This is a perfectly defensible position. Absence of evidence, hostile preservation conditions, the ice itself erases everything. But here is where the pattern starts to compound in ways I find genuinely difficult to explain away. Across the ancient world, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the pre-Columbian cultures of South America, there exists a remarkably consistent set of origin myths. Gods or divine teachers who arrived from an unknown land, who brought agriculture, who brought astronomy, who brought mathematics and writing, and the organizational principles of civilization, seemingly without the gradual developmental curve we would expect from indigenous invention. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Egyptians spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an era before recorded history, when divine beings ruled the land directly. I am not suggesting these were aliens. I want to be clear about that, because the moment that word enters the room, the whole conversation shifts into territory I have no interest in. I am suggesting something far simpler, and in some ways, far more unsettling. I am suggesting the possibility that these myths are memories, distorted, encoded in religious language, stripped of specificity across generations of retelling, but memories of people, of a civilization that existed before the civilizations we know, one that, when its homeland disappeared beneath the ice, sent its survivors outward into a world that received them as gods. The problem with this hypothesis, and I am going to name the problem clearly because intellectual honesty requires it, is that it is unfalsifiable in the way all deep history theories risk becoming. If the civilization was sophisticated enough to teach the Sumerians mathematics, why did they leave no direct physical record? Why do we have no ruins, no artifacts, no carbon-dated evidence of a pre-ice settlement on the Antarctic coast? There are two answers I keep returning to. The first is practical. 2 miles of glacial ice is an extraordinary archaeological barrier. The Antarctic ice sheet moves, it grinds, it compresses, it destroys. Whatever physical record may have existed on those ancient coastlines has been, in all likelihood, obliterated or buried at a depth that no current technology can reach economically. We have not excavated beneath the ice, we have mapped the subglacial topography with radar, and we have drilled cores for climate data. We have not gone looking for ruins. The second answer is harder to sit with, and it is the one that brought me to what I think of as the coordination problem. Because beginning in 1959, with the signing of the Antarctic Treaty, a legal framework was established that effectively removed Antarctica from the jurisdictional reach of any single nation. Research is permitted, tourism with restrictions, but any activity that resembles resource extraction, including arguably large-scale archaeological excavation, is prohibited or heavily regulated. The treaty has been renewed and expanded. It now has 54 signatories. I am not suggesting the Antarctic Treaty was designed to conceal evidence of a lost civilization. That would be a specific claim I cannot support. What I am suggesting is something subtler, that the effect of the treaty, whatever its intent, is to institutionalize a particular kind of silence. Not a deliberate silence, not a conspiratorial one, a structural silence, the kind that emerges when the interests of many separate institutions, military, scientific, diplomatic, commercial, happen to align around the same outcome. That Antarctica remains exactly as inaccessible, exactly as unexamined as it has always been. No one needed to coordinate. Coordination was not required. The silence organized itself out of shared institutional incentive, the way all durable silences do, and I find, when I look at the history of Antarctica research closely, that the moments when that silence nearly broke are the most interesting moments of all. In 1938 and 1939, Nazi Germany sent an expedition to Antarctica. This is documented history. They mapped a large region of the continent, claimed a territory they named Neuschwabenland, and dropped metal swastika flags across hundreds of kilometers of ice from aircraft. The official explanation for this expedition, and again it is a reasonable one, is that Germany was seeking territory for a whaling base and attempting to project imperial power. Strategic, not mysterious. But the scope and the timing are strange. Germany in 1938 was a nation in accelerated military build-up, rationing resources for war, and yet it committed a significant naval and scientific expedition to the most remote location on Earth in the year before it invaded Poland. The expedition was led by Alfred Richer, a professional naval officer. The maps produced were detailed and sophisticated, and the follow-up, whatever follow-up there may have been, has never been fully declassified or publicly accounted for. Admiral Richard Byrd's post-war expeditions to Antarctica are perhaps the most analysed and debated in the conspiracy literature, and I want to approach them carefully because the literature has not been kind to the evidence. Operation High Jump in 1946 and 1947 was genuinely one of the largest military operations ever mounted in Antarctica. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 men, for a training exercise, for a scientific survey. The official explanation is plausible. The Cold War was beginning, and the United States wanted to establish operational experience in polar warfare environments, potentially anticipating Soviet activity in the region. This makes strategic sense, and yet the scale still bothers me. You do not need 4,000 personnel and a carrier group to conduct a scientific survey. You need dozens of researchers and a supply ship. The disproportion between stated purpose and actual deployment is something I cannot file away cleanly. What is less reported, and what I keep coming back to, is the abrupt end of Operation High Jump. It was planned for 8 months. It was terminated after 8 weeks. The official reason given was weather, and Antarctic weather is genuinely brutal. I am not dismissing weather as a factor, but 8 months of planning and preparation for an operation you withdraw from in 8 weeks, citing weather conditions that were entirely predictable for that season, does not resolve neatly. Byrd, in an interview with a Chilean newspaper in March 1947 as he returned, made a comment that has been quoted and misquoted so many times it has become nearly mythological. He referred, apparently, to a potential threat, a strategic concern that aircraft or forces could travel from pole to pole at great speed. The exact quote is disputed. The interview is real. What he meant, whether he was speaking to Antarctic-specific concerns, Soviet military capability, or something else entirely, remains unclear. I am not going to build a tower on that foundation, but I am also not going to pretend the comment does not exist. Here is what I keep returning to. Underneath all of this, not the maps, not the expeditions, not the treaty. The thing I cannot stop thinking about is the timeline of human civilization itself, because the standard model of human development contains an anomaly that the model itself struggles to explain. We have evidence of Homo sapiens as a behaviorally modern species, capable of symbolic thought, language, planning, complex social organization for at least 100,000 years, possibly longer. And for the vast majority of that time, by all available evidence, nothing much happened. Small bands of people moving, hunting, surviving. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, in multiple locations across the globe, apparently independently, something shifted. Agriculture, architecture, writing, mathematics, astronomy sophisticated enough to track precession cycles that take 26,000 years to complete, all of it in multiple locations in the span of a few thousand years. The standard explanation is environmental. The end of the last ice age created conditions favourable for sedentary life, which enabled the surpluses that enabled civilization. And this explanation is probably true. Probably. But there is a version of it that gets left out of the textbook summary. The version where the end of the last ice age included, in its transition, a period of catastrophic flooding, megafauna extinction, climate disruption, and the rapid glaciation of a continent that had, until that moment, been a potential cradle of organized human life, What if the anomaly of civilization's sudden emergence is not a mystery about us? What if it is a memory of them? I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I am not proposing a polished theory. I am not presenting this as a conclusion. I am presenting it as a question that the available evidence does not cleanly rule out, and that the standard frameworks do not cleanly answer. A civilization that developed in Antarctica's temperate period, however primitive, however small, that was forced by advancing glaciation to migrate northward, carrying with it whatever knowledge it had accumulated, and seeding that knowledge into populations that were already there, already human, already capable. The populations did not need the teachers needed the populations. And if that is true, even partially true, even as a framework that fits the evidence without contradicting it, then the history we have been given is not wrong. Exactly. It is simply incomplete in a way that changes everything about what it means. The silence around Antarctica is not the silence of nothing being there. I have spent enough time with institutional silence to know the difference between the silence of absence and the silence of deliberate non-examination. Antarctica has not been examined. Not really. Not in the way we examine places we genuinely believe have nothing to tell us. We do not station military forces at confirmed dead ends. We do not sign international treaties to regulate access to places we are certain hold no secrets. You could argue, and it is a fair argument, that the treaty exists for environmental reasons, for geopolitical stability, to prevent territorial conflict over a militarily strategic location. All of those motivations are real. None of them require a hidden civilization to be operational. I accept that. What I notice is that the same treaty, for the same practical reasons, happens to produce the same outcome: the systematic non-examination of a continent that by its own geology was habitable until 12,000 years ago, and whose subglacial topography was somehow partially represented on maps drawn by cartographers who should not have had access to that data. These things may all be coincidences. The maps may be wishful thinking and cartographic projection. The expeditions may be exactly what their official records describe. The myths of divine civilizers may be universal archetypes arising independently from shared psychological need. Each individual piece of this, taken alone, has a reasonable explanation. I am aware of that. I hold that awareness as carefully as I hold everything else I have laid out here. But I am also aware of how patterns work, how they do not announce themselves, how they accumulate quietly, in the margins of official accounts, in the gaps between what is documented and what is released, in the disproportions that get filed under administrative ambiguity and forgotten, how the reasonable explanation for each individual piece does not automatically constitute a reasonable explanation for all of them together. The pieces are not what concern me. The geometry is, because when I lay out the full picture, the pre-glacial habitability, the anomalous maps, the abrupt emergence of coordinated civilization worldwide, the scale of military interest in an uninhabited continent, the legal architecture that structurally prevents deep examination, the myths that encode the same archetypal arrival story across cultures that never met, what I am looking at is not a series of coincidences. What I am looking at is a shape, and the shape has a center that no one has officially looked at directly. I am not telling you there is a lost civilization beneath the Antarctic ice. I am not qualified to tell you that, and neither, in honest terms, is anyone else, because the examination that would settle the question has not been performed. That is the point I keep arriving at, and I think it is the most important one in all of this, not what is there, not what happened, but the fact that we have as a species in full possession of the technological means to look, consistently chosen not to look, And I find that choice more interesting than any answer looking might produce, because choices like that, coordinated not by conspiracy, but by institutional gravity, maintained not by enforcement, but by professional disincentive, preserved not by force, but by the gentle social pressure that keeps curious people from asking the questions their institutions would rather they did not. Those choices are not made about nothing. They are made about something that, if examined, would require a great deal of very settled history to be quietly, carefully, and permanently revised. I do not know what is under the ice. I do not know what those maps recorded or how they recorded it. I do not know what birds saw or did not see, what the German expedition found or did not find, what the treaty was designed to prevent, or what it simply, incidentally, prevents. I hold all of that uncertainty without apology. Uncertainty, in the face of genuine complexity, is not weakness. It is the only honest position available. But I keep thinking about the ice, about what is underneath it, about the 12,000 years of compression and silence sitting on top of whatever is, or was, or once moved and thought and looked out at a temperate sky that no human eye alive today has ever seen. I keep thinking about what it means that an entire continent was erased from human memory, or perhaps not erased, but encoded, disguised as myth, as theology, as the memory of gods who came from the south and taught the world how to count the stars. I keep thinking about what kind of civilization leaves no ruins and only legends, and I think the answer to that, if there is one, is a civilization that did not have the luxury of leaving slowly, one that left the way a tide retreats, all at once, carrying almost nothing, looking back at something they knew they would never see again, something that was already, even as they walked away from it, beginning to disappear under the first heavy snow of a winter that would last 12,000 years. There is a continent at the bottom of the world. It is larger than Europe. It has not been examined. And somewhere beneath 2 miles of ice, there is a question that the ice has been keeping very, very quietly, waiting, with a patience that makes the entirety of recorded human civilization look like an afternoon, for someone to finally think to ask it. The island has no reason to be famous. It sits off the coast of western Antarctica, a cold shelf of rock and ice that most people could not locate on a map if they tried. Rothschild Island, named in 1904 by a French naval officer whose expedition, the records confirm, had been funded by that very family. That detail by itself is not alarming. Wealthy patrons funded expeditions in the early 20th century the way venture capitalists fund startups today. They wanted prestige, they wanted naming rights, they wanted their surnames pressed into the geography of an unmapped world. It is an entirely reasonable explanation, and I held it for a long time. But then I started reading the actual expedition reports, not summaries, not secondary accounts written decades after the fact. The original published records, with the scientific appendices intact. And somewhere in that reading I found something I have been trying, genuinely and carefully, to dismiss ever since. I want to walk through it now, out loud, where the logic is visible. Jean-Baptiste Charcot was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished polar scientists of his era. A French naval officer and physician, trained first in neurology before turning to exploration, he led France's first Antarctic expedition from 1903 to 1905, then returned for a larger, better equipped second expedition from 1908 to 1910. That second voyage was made aboard the Pourquoi Pas, which translates, with something almost uncomfortably fitting about it, as "Why not?" It produced a widely respected body of scientific work, geographic surveys, meteorological records, biological specimen collections. His published account from 1910, Le Pourquoi Pas, dans l'Antarctique, is regarded as a meticulous record of early polar science. The official historical record treats both expeditions as genuine achievements. Charcot charted portions of the western Antarctic peninsula that no modern expedition had previously mapped, produced the region's first sustained meteorological data, and named dozens of geographic features that still appear on current charts. His reputation is well documented, and it is deserved. I am not contesting any of it. The geological consensus on the Rothschild Island sector is equally stable. The island and the surrounding chain are understood as products of glacial erosion and volcanic uplift, a geologically young landscape shaped primarily by the forces of the last glacial maximum. Standard Antarctic morphology, coherent, internally consistent, supported by decades of survey work that came long after Charcot returned home. I want to be honest about this. The standard account does not rest on wishful thinking. It rests on real data, real fieldwork, and institutional consensus accumulated over more than a century. The scientists who established it were not careless. The framework that holds these islands as ordinary glacial terrain is not something I can dismiss, and I have tried hard to treat it fairly. The problem, and it is a quiet one, the kind that hides in a footnote rather than announces itself, appears in Charcot's own published account, in passages describing the coastal profiles of islands in the Marguerite Bay sector. He noted that certain formations showed morphological profiles inconsistent with the glacial modelling of the period. He was precise. He did not elaborate. He moved on. One sentence of measured caution, then the next page of meteorological tables. The scientific literature absorbed the observation the same way it absorbed everything else about that expedition. Smoothly, efficiently, without argument, without any published response, challenging or confirming what he had described. The anomaly was logged, and then, quietly, it stopped mattering. I want to be careful not to overstate what that absence means. Scientists flag anomalies and never return to them all the time, because funding ends, because other problems seem more pressing, because a single observation from a single surveyor in a region generating far more questions than answers is not, by itself, the foundation of a research program. That is how science actually works. But the specific character of Charcot's note matters here. He was not describing something impressionistic. He was a trained hydrographer, describing a geometric inconsistency in coastal architecture, a profile that, under the glacial modelling he would have applied, should not have been shaped the way it was. That is a precise claim. It deserved a precise response. It never received one. In 1929, researchers cataloguing the Topkapi Palace archives in Istanbul came across a map that had been sitting uncatalogued for centuries. It had been drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis. Its rediscovery attracted immediate academic interest. Then someone looked carefully at the coastline depicted at the bottom of the page, and the interest became something harder to categorize. The southern section of the Piri Reis map depicts a coastline that several researchers, most rigorously the American geographer Charles Hapgood, argued closely resembles the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Not the ice-covered surface as it appears today, but the rock profile underneath the ice sheet, Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The map was drawn in 1513. The mainstream explanation for this is real and deserves to be taken seriously. Early cartographers operated under the Aristotelian tradition of a terra australis incognita, a theoretical southern continent invented to balance the known northern land masses. The southern shapes on the Pyrie race map could represent that invented geography, distorted by the map's non-standard projection. That is not an unreasonable argument, and I have applied it honestly to what I was looking at. In 1960, Charles Hapgood presented his analysis to a cartographic evaluation unit of the United States Air Force. They're technical specialists, people whose professional function was geographic precision, examined the subglacial correspondence and issued a formal written response. They stated that they could not account for the accuracy of the depicted profile through any known 16th century cartographic method. That letter exists. It is part of the documented record. It has not been retracted. Now I want to acknowledge the strongest version of the counter-argument here, because intellectual honesty requires it. Hapgood's alignment methodology has been contested by cartographic historians who argue he was fitting a distorted map to a coastline he had already decided was there. That is a legitimate critique. Hapgood was not a neutral analyst, and his broader conclusions about ancient civilizations were not accepted by mainstream academic geography. But the Air Force response does not depend on Hapgood's methodology. Those were independent technical analysts evaluating the geometric alignment on its own terms, without his theoretical framework. Their conclusion, that no known 16th century cartographic method could account for the subglacial precision, was stated formally, without hedging, and was never formally contradicted by any institution with comparable technical standing. That is a different order of claim. Let me place those two things side by side without connecting them. Charcot, in 1908, notes a morphological inconsistency in the coastal architecture of the Rothschild Island sector and leaves it permanently unresolved. A 1513 map depicts the subglacial topography of that same geographic region with precision that military cartographers could not explain. I am not saying these are the same story. I am noting that they share a location. That geographic convergence is either meaningful or coincidental, and I cannot tell you which. What I can say is that when two independent anomalies, separated by 4 centuries of human history, point to the same stretch of Antarctic coastline, the coincidence argument requires a particular kind of patience that I find increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of what comes next. Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition ran from 1907 to 1909, overlapping almost exactly with Charcot's second voyage. Shackleton's geographic focus was the Ross Sea sector, meaningfully separate from the Western Peninsula, and I want to be precise about that. But both expeditions produced reports in which specific anomalous observations were formally noted, and then, without any subsequent academic engagement, left permanently unresolved. I am not claiming Shackleton found anything connected to what Charcot found. I am observing a shared structure in how 2 separate expeditions operating under different national flags, funded by different sources, led by scientists with different disciplinary training, handled the anomalies their work produced. They noted them with professional precision. They filed them in the published record. They never returned to them. That symmetry is strange, not because any one expedition's handling of its anomalies is inexplicable in isolation. All the individual decisions make reasonable sense as individual decisions. What is strange is the uniformity. 2 separate scientific institutions, across 2 separate nations, exhibiting identical behavior toward a specific category of observation. The behavior pattern is more diagnostic than the observations themselves. Here is the coordination problem, and I want to be as precise as I can about what I mean by it. The level of uniformity in that pattern, the same methodical noting, the same permanent silence from institutions that had no formal relationship with each other, would have required active coordination if it had been deliberate. But I am not suggesting it was deliberate. What I am describing happens without architects. The scientific establishment of that era had invested enormous credibility in a coherent account of natural history, one that placed meaningful human geographic knowledge at a specific identifiable starting point. Anomalies threatening that framework did not need to be suppressed by decree. They were deprioritized by shared professional instinct, by the unspoken understanding that some findings cost more than they explain. A note in a published account, a formal observation left formally unresolved, not erased, never erased, just given no oxygen. The silence organized itself the way institutional silences always do, through shared interest, through the gravitational pull of a framework that no individual scientist chose to dismantle, because no individual had the authority or the incentive to absorb the cost of doing so alone. That is harder to challenge than a named conspiracy. A conspiracy has actors, motives, and documents. It can, in principle, be investigated. An institutional silence that emerged organically from professionals sharing the same training and the same structural anxieties is invisible by design. It does not look like suppression, it looks like caution, it looks like professional restraint. That is precisely what makes it so durable. I need to stop here and name the most important objection, because intellectual honesty requires it. The architecture of what I have laid out is built substantially on absence, on what was not followed up, on what was not explained. Absence is the weakest form of evidence available in any investigation, and I know that. I am not pretending otherwise. An argument built on gaps can always be answered with, "There's nothing there," and that answer is philosophically very difficult to disprove. I have sat with that objection for a long time. Here is why I do not find it fully sufficient. When you map the unanswered observations, not just their content, but their precise geographic coordinates, they do not scatter, they cluster. They do not distribute randomly across the continent, the way you would expect from ordinary scientific negligence, from expeditions generating more anomalous data than they had the resources to process. They concentrate in the western Antarctic Peninsula, in the island chains, in the specific latitudinal band that includes Rothschild Island. Absence has a shape here, and that shape is not accidental looking. Now let me return to Edmund de Rothschild, because his involvement has never satisfied me as a story about prestige. His patronage across his documented life was not characterized by fashionable interest in geographical discovery. It was characterized by precision, by long-term thinking, and by investment in things he had specific reasons to understand. The polar expedition is an anomaly in his own portfolio. Why Antarctica in 1903? Why that specific expedition at the precise moment when the western Antarctic Peninsula was being charted by a modern nation for the first time? The conventional answer, prestige, the fashionable interest of wealthy patrons in geographic discovery, is not a bad one. I have offered it to myself honestly. But it sits uncomfortably with what the biographical record tells us about how he made decisions. Edmund de Rothschild's documented investments were almost uniformly precise and purposeful. His agricultural support in Palestine was long-term and built on intimate knowledge of what he was funding. His patronage of French vineyard infrastructure reflected the same calculus. He was not a man who gave money to fashionable causes. He gave money to things he had specific reason to care about, and specific reason to understand. His sole act of polar patronage placed his name permanently on an island in the most remote sector of the most isolated continent on Earth, in the precise geographic band where the oldest cartographic anomaly in the modern record converges, and where Charcot would later note something he described carefully and then declined to press. I am holding that adjacency, without drawing a line through it. Charcot returned from his second expedition in 1910. His account was published. The anomalous observation was filed. The Pourquoi Pas went on to become one of the most celebrated ships in French polar history, and Charcot himself was regarded as a national scientific hero until his death in 1936. The official story ended cleanly, neatly, and without visible friction of any kind. Meanwhile, the subglacial profile of the Antarctic coast that a 16th century Ottoman cartographer reproduced with precision sufficient to trouble United States military analysts still has no institutional explanation. No published paper has resolved it. No formal academic position accounts for where that knowledge came from. The gap remains. It has simply been given a different quality of silence over the decades since anyone stopped actively asking. The kind of silence that exists not because no one has noticed, but because noticing requires explaining, and explaining requires accepting that at some point someone surveyed that coastline, someone gathered that data, someone had the capability, the organizational structure, and the specific motivation to map the rock profile of a continent that no known civilization of the ancient world was supposed to have reached. If that knowledge existed, it was not born in a vacuum. It was gathered at a specific location, by specific people, using methods we have not been given a framework to understand. At some point between its creation and its appearance on a 1513 Ottoman map, it passed through hands we have no record of, toward purposes that no institution currently acknowledges. That chain had a beginning somewhere. I do not know what Charcot found on Rothschild Island in 1908. I genuinely don't. The answer may be nothing, the anomaly a real but minor geological quirk, his caution simple professional precision, the funding exactly what it appeared to be. I hold that possibility seriously. Minds looking for patterns will find them whether they exist or not, and I am not claiming exemption from that failure. What I cannot fully account for is the geometric consistency of these particular gaps in these particular locations across these particular centuries. The subglacial match is too precise to be easily set aside. The morphological observation is too specific to be easily forgotten. The geographic convergence of these unanswered questions is too concentrated to be explained by the ordinary chaos of scientific negligence. What was being looked for in that sector? In 1908, what did a precision-minded hydrographer operating under patronage with no obvious strategic rationale observe in those coastal formations that warranted careful notation and then permanent silence? What did someone, at some point before 1513, do in those waters that left a mark precise enough to survive 4 centuries and still disturb a military cartographer in 1960? I don't have answers. What I have is the shape of the silence, the geographic precision of what was left unresolved, the institutional symmetry of how it was left, and the quiet fact that someone decided it was worth spending significant private money to be among the first to arrive at the edge of the most isolated landmass on Earth. Decisions like that are made for reasons. Rothschild Island, a name on a map at the bottom of the world, placed there by a meticulous scientist, funded by a man whose usual investments were specific, purposeful, and not given to impulse. An island sitting in the precise latitudinal band where a 500-year-old cartographic puzzle converges. Visited carefully once, described carefully once, and then, quietly, left alone. The subglacial profile of the Antarctic coast has an origin. That data came from somewhere. It was gathered by someone who was standing at a vantage point that the accepted history of human civilization says no one should have been standing at. And whatever that someone carried back from those waters, it entered the record once, in 1513, and then went still for 4.5 centuries, until a French naval officer sailed into that same sector in 1908, noted that something in the coastal architecture didn't fit the standard models, and then moved to the next page of tables. The question is not whether he saw something, the question is whether he understood what he was looking at, and whether anyone who later read that published account, in quiet, understood it too. That is where I stop, not because the question is answered, but because I have run out of accessible documents. The island is still there. The silence around it remains structured in that same careful, institutionally coherent way. Not aggressive, not defensive, just complete. Like a door with no lock, no sign on it, that has simply, in every record I can find, never been opened. But it had to have been opened once. That is the thing I cannot stop sitting with. Someone knew where to go. Someone already knew what was there, and the name they left on the island is the only mark on the outside of the door that has survived long enough for anyone still awake to read it.